Matt Desmond, our new friend, is the Maurice During Professor of Sociology and the founding director of the Eviction Lab at Princeton. He's the author of 5 books, including Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, which won the Pulitzer Prize, National Book Critics Circle Award, the Carnegie Mellon, the Carnegie Medal, and Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. Professor Desmond's research focuses on poverty in America, city life, housing insecurity, public policy, racial inequality, and ethnography. He's also the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award, and the William Julius Wilson Early Career Award. He's a great human. Alex Kotlowitz is new to FAN, and we're so glad to have his services tonight. He's the author of 4 books, including his most recent, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, which received the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize. His first book, the national bestseller, There Are No Children Here, was selected by the New York Public Library as one of the 150 most important books of the 20th century. The Other Side of the River received the Chicago Tribune's Heartland Prize for Nonfiction. His work regularly appears in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and on This American Life. His documentary work includes The Interrupters, for which he received a Film Independent Spirit Award and an Emmy. His other honors include 2 Peabodys, a George Polk Award, and the Harold Washington Literary Award, and he is a professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Whew. Lots of power on this stage. So now let's welcome Matt Desmond and Alex Kotlowitz.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Matt, again. I got to tell you, this is such a beautiful, inspired, and necessary book. I think of it as a cri de coeur, literally a cry from the heart. And I just think it's one of these books that should be passed around from family member to family member and friend to friend. It's also in a strange way, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. I want to talk about it a little bit later. It's also, in a strange way, a book that I think can contribute some to the healing in this deeply wounded nation. But I want to begin where you begin in your book, which is the suggestion that, writing about poverty that's been done, and I would include There Are No Children Here in that, is, solely focused on the poor. It's looked at, it's looked at helping us find empathy with those who are struggling and persevering, all of which I think has been very important. But I'd be the first to tell you that it's been 30-some years since There Are No Children Here, and I think for me what is so sobering is how little things have changed, and in some ways have gotten worse. And you write at the very beginning of your book that to understand the causes of poverty, we must look beyond the poor. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's just such an honor to be in conversation with you, Alex. You've been such a hero to me. And you've been such a guiding light to me in your work. And I love There Are No Children Here, and I love all of your books. And I count Evicted among that tradition of bearing witness and exposing the human cost of poverty and inequality and racism in our country. I think those books are incredibly important and necessary and cannot answer this one fundamental question, which is why? Why is there so much poverty here? And a novelist I quote in this book, Tommy Orange, has this line, it's like these kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is that they're jumping. And so when I read that, I was like, that's the poverty debate. And I want to try to write a book about the fire. I want to write a book about who set it, who's warming their hands by it. And so I do think that means taking our eyes off the jumpers, no matter how important those kind of works are, and really trying to focus, expand the aperture and focus on all of us in this story.
And was there something coming out of Evicted that kind of pushed you to ask this question?
I think so. Like, one of the big questions I had when I went into Evicted was, why would you buy a trailer park in South Milwaukee? And then when I stopped researching that book, I was like, why wouldn't you buy a trailer park in South Milwaukee? Tobin, the property owner that I profiled for that book, I lived in his mobile home park. It was 131 trailers, the poorest white section of the 4th poorest city in our country. And he let me see his rent rolls, right? So I calculated his expenses and his water bill and his property taxes and saw how much people were behind every month. And I learned that he brought home like over $400,000 a year after expenses, right? Which is like a lifetime of difference between his station and the tenants that he was renting to. And so it really forced me to kind of look at poverty as this relationship of extraction. And so I brought that here. And I guess since we're in Chicago, I have to mention the book by Beryl Satter, Family Properties,
right.
which is about contract selling in Chicago, which had a deep effect on me. And she has this beautiful introduction to that book where she says, you know, there was so much attention into these poor black communities in Chicago because there was so much money to be made there. And we have to stop talking about poverty as a lack and start talking about it as a relation of extraction, of robbery. And I think that book had a big impact on my thinking. Well,
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I mean, sort of, you know, how you think about what it means to be poor in this country now, because it is one, as you say, of extraction or exploitation, which you talk about in the book. And so, because often there's this myth, and you especially hear this from people on the right, that, oh, how can these people be poor? They've got all the material goods that one could need, TVs, cars, cell phones.
yeah.
And yet, well, can you talk a little bit about poverty? I mean, because in some ways the poverty, what we think of as the poverty line is this kind of arbitrary measure.
Totally, yeah. You can't need a cell phone, right? Can't trade a TV in for a living wage. Can't trade an Xbox in for adequate dental care. And so as the cost of things that we don't need have gotten a lot cheaper, the cost of things that we do need have gotten a lot more expensive. Median rent has doubled over the last 20 years. The cost of fuel and utilities have increased 115%. And so, you know, the poor living in the epicenter of global capitalism have access to all these cheap goods like we do, but, you know, just as Michael Harrington put it 60 years ago, it's easier to be well clothed in America than well housed and well doctored. I think that's still true. The poverty line is arbitrary, and it's probably way too low, right? So a family of four today, basically if you're making under $27,000 a year, you're officially poor. There's this other category called the supplemental poverty measure that corrects for a lot of the limitations that the official poverty line has. That shows even more poverty, 3 million more people poor. If the officially poor in America founded a country, that country would be bigger than Australia in population. But like, how many of us think that getting by on $28,000 is there? You know, $29,000. Gallup did this poll in 2013, and they asked Americans, like, what do you think, like, what's the bare minimum you need to get by? And the average American was like 60K. So, you know, our poverty line is way out of step with how much kind of we're thinking about what we actually need in this country. There's plenty of poverty above the line.
Yeah, and you don't write about this a lot in the book, but you do allude to it also too, what poverty or even inequality does to the spirit. Right. I mean, does to the soul. I always remember there was a moment when I was working on There Are No Children Here, and Mother Teresa had come to visit Chicago in the late 1980s, and she came to that very neighborhood. And what struck her was not so much the poverty of the pocketbook, but what she called as the poverty of the spirit.
Yeah.
And I sense, you know, you raise this towards the end of the book about sort of what inequality does to how we think about ourselves.
Yeah, I think inequality corrupts our spirit on both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
I think that for those of us that are struggling, poverty is not just an income level, right? But this incredibly compounded mess of social problems, right? You've written so much about violence. You've written about public housing, you know, and public housing isn't just a roof over your head, right? It's degradation, often humiliation. It's often that you see the government divesting from you and your family, and just this kind of tight knot of social maladies. And then for those of us that have found security, inequality often means like this scared, frightened, isolated affluence that has come to characterize a lot of American life. A spiritual poverty, if you will.
Right. a spiritual poverty, and then also, I guess, a spiritual poverty on the part of the affluent as well. That's what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. So let's get to the core of the book, which is you sort of ask this question. You point out that I think for many of us, when we think about the poor, that it's about people making the right choices, about people taking responsibility, people having the right kind of morals. And you ask this question, you say that really the question we need to be asking is who benefits?
Yeah, who benefits?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is about us. You know, this isn't about them. For over 100 years, the poverty debates have been about them, right? Mm-hmm. It's been about folks that are below the line. It's been folks that are struggling. I've been below the line in my life. I was raised poor and grew up hard. But I think that, we have to think about us. So we used to have this debate about a culture of poverty in America, right? Do the poor behave differently than everyone else? And I think we do have a culture of poverty. But it's our culture. It's a culture of exploitation. It's a culture of opportunity hoarding. It's a culture of union busting. It's a culture of segregation. And I think that we need to kind of turn the gaze on us. And by us, I don't just mean the guy that's like just a little richer than you. That guy, just like that guy there. I mean a lot of us that have found some security and comfort in this country. I think we're implicated in this in ways that we know, and some ways that we don't know too. Mm-hmm.
Right. And also, too, I think it's also about kind of the myths that we carry about others, right? I mean, for example, this notion of welfare dependency, that people, that welfare leads to this kind of dependent mentality. And as you say, there's almost kind of a really just the opposite of kind of welfare avoidance that we've...
Yeah, it was amazing to me how much we heard about welfare dependence in COVID, right? It was such a strong narrative, like we're paying Americans to stay home, no one's coming to their jobs, and it made like sense to us. It like sounded right, and then the numbers came out at the end of the summer in 2021, and it showed that states that got rid of a bunch of benefits didn't have better job numbers than states that kept the benefits. It was basically a tie. People weren't, staying at home because they were getting paid to, and I think that if you look at the data, one thing that amazed me researching this book is like how much money low-income families are leaving on the table every year. We're talking about like billions and billions of dollars. So like 1 in 5 elderly Americans that qualify for food stamps don't take it. 1 in 5 poorly paid workers that qualify for earned income tax credit, this wage bump that you get at tax season, don't take it. If you add that up with the folks that avoid unemployment insurance and supplemental security income and government health insurance that all qualify for this, I learned that like over $140 billion every year is left on the table by families. So this is not a picture of welfare dependence. This is the opposite. This is a picture of us as a nation doing a really terrible job connecting families to these programs.
So why is it they leave all that money on the table?
So we used to think it was stigma. We used to think people were prideful and embarrassed. And there is something to that. There is a degradation ritual that we continue to make the poor go through to access benefits. I'm a homeowner now. I get the mortgage interest deduction. No one tells me to do anything about that. No one checks on how I'm spending that money. I can just do it. But for poor folks, it's different, right? You come in the welfare office, wait a half a day, fill out these forms. In some states, to get welfare, you got to get a fingerprint, like you're a criminal. But there's some data that show that stigma really isn't it. So like basically everyone in Oregon that qualifies for food stamps receives them, but in California it's only 63%. So is food stamps way more stigmatized in California? No, something else is going on. And what's going on is red tape and regulation and complexity, and we made these programs incredibly hard to apply for and reapply for, which is both completely frustrating because if we know how to do anything in America, it's like market stuff to people and deliver stuff to people, right? Like I can pull out my phone and order like anything and it'll be on my door tomorrow. And I wish we applied that same amount of energy and creativity and brilliance to connecting families to these programs. And so that's the frustrating part. The hopeful part is like, there are these little tweaks that can really open up these programs. So if you connect elderly folks to like someone on the phone for 20 minutes, the take-up rate for food stamps goes up a lot. If you just change the font on earned income tax credit applications and make it bigger and spaced out, people apply for it more. So I think that this is the lowest of low-hanging fruit, the least we can do.
Yeah, no, I love that. One of the things I love about the book is how practical it is.
Yeah.
And there's that moment where you talk about, like, all we need to do is just increase the font and just make the language clearer.
Yeah.
I mean, which just seems so self-evident, one would think.
Yeah, and we know this, right?
Yeah.
Like our corporations know this, right? It's like few words as possible, few clicks as possible, get them in and out. But we don't do that when it comes to these life-saving benefits.
So why are we so blinded to this?
I think there's a part of it that's callousness.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a part of it that's government inefficiency for realsies. And then I think there's a part of it, and the callousness manifests in things like, instead of just automatically updating someone's benefits, or like saying, we'll just take them off the rolls and make them reapply every year all over again, which is just a really terribly hard thing to do. And then it's true that sometimes folks are really treated like borderline criminals when they're just applying for basic welfare needs.
Right, yeah, sometimes I wonder whether some of these institutions haven't sort of lost sight of sort of why they're there, that they sort of see themselves as kind of policing rather than sort of often. I always remember again, with There Are No Children Here, there's a moment when, I had written a story for the Wall Street Journal that led to the book, and public department, and I mentioned in passing that the father, who is separated from the children's mom, would come and sleep on the couch occasionally. Yeah. And somebody in public aid read that and thought, we have ourselves here a welfare cheat, and cut the family off of public aid. Yeah. And I sometimes wonder, is it just that we've kind of sort of lost sight about why these institutions, why these programs exist?
Right. Yeah. And again, and what's crazy to me, right, is here's a family, right? They're trying to be a family. And we hear so much about, the role of the family, let's build up the family. Right. But these programs are so anti-family, right? If you apply for food stamps as a married couple, you get less than if you applied separately. Same with the earned income tax credit. With housing assistance, right? If you let someone that's not on the lease sleep over at your house, like your cousin that just got evicted, or your boyfriend, or that can lead to you losing that benefit. Right. And so it's kind of enraging that if we talk so much about the importance of the family, we certainly don't back that up with how we design social policy.
Right. Yeah, family and community. It really, it's just so disruptive of community. The other thing you write about too is that also a lot of these funds, like TANF, which is now what's replaced what we've traditionally known as welfare, has simply been misused or not spent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So welfare gets reformed in 1996 under a Democratic president, Clinton, and it turns into a block grant, which is just a wonky way of saying, hey, states, here's some money, spend it how you'd like to. It's actually illegal for the federal government to look at how states spend TANF money, which is crazy. And so states have exercised a lot of creativity with respect to how they spend welfare dollars. Some states used welfare dollars to fund Christian summer camps or abstinence-only training or marriage counseling. You guys probably read about Mississippi in the news last year that literally spent welfare dollars on to buy people trucks and to pay Brett Favre over $1 million in speaking fees for speeches he never gave. And
he's not very popular around here.
Yeah,
anyway,
okay.
Yeah.
I don't like Brett Favre either, but it's because he left the Packers. But the bigger picture, right, is for every dollar in TANF money that's budgeted, only 22 cents ends up in the family's hands in terms of dollars in hand. And that's an abstract thing, but that means kids aren't getting enough to eat, right? That means families are getting evicted. The average age of an evicted child in America is 7. This is kind of what it means on a human level. And this isn't just a red state thing. There's only one state that dedicates most of its welfare funds to actually cash welfare, and that's Kentucky. And there's plenty of other states that just don't do anything with the money. States don't have to. So Tennessee, last time I checked, was sitting on over $700 million in unused welfare funds. Hawaii was sitting on, our bluest state, was sitting on so much welfare funds that they could give every kid in the state below the poverty line $10,000.
So when you say Tennessee's sitting on $700 million of welfare funds, practically what does that mean? That they've banked all this money?
They've banked the funds, yeah. So funds come to the federal government, they've issued some out, and they've banked others for reasons that I don't understand. Tennessee has the 5th highest child poverty rate in the nation.
And is nobody in Tennessee kind of pushing the state to use these funds? Is it?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
It used to be the case, right, where we had a welfare revolution and rebellion, and getting on welfare was part of like a right in this country, right? And it was led often by African American women because the aid had been racist and like really left a lot of folks out of the picture. And then they won this entitlement, and soon thereafter we yanked it away.
No, I remember I was a community organizer in the 70s and worked with the Welfare Rights Organization in Atlanta. Yeah,
we're learning something about you.
Yeah, and this is back at a time when you're right, when the poor really you felt like they had a voice. You know, they were pushing back, and that's been lost. The other thing you write, you mentioned in the book, you quote James Baldwin from 1961, where you just something to the effect that it's extremely expensive to be poor.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because one of the things you mentioned in the book is that if he were alive today, he would be stunned at how much more expensive it's become.
I think that's true. Yeah. Maybe I'll talk about housing and finance.
Sure. Yeah.
So with just financial exploitation. Every year, about $11 billion are pulled out of the pockets of the poor in overdraft fees from banks. Only 9% of bank users pay 84% of those fees. Who are those 9%? They're poor people made to pay for their poverty. Add that with $1.6 billion in check cashing fees, just money poor folks have to pay just to get their money. And then about $10 billion in payday loan fees. That's $61 million a day. $61 million a day pulled out of the pockets of the poor. Who benefits from that? Well, the banks do and the payday loan companies do, but many of us do too, because our free checking accounts aren't free, actually. They're subsidized by these overdraft fees that are piled on the backs of the poor. Or take housing. You know, we're in a situation now where most poor families who are renters pay at least half of their income on housing costs, and about 1 in 4 spend over 70% of their income just on rent and utilities. Why? Is it because it takes that much to maintain housing in poor neighborhoods? It does not. It turns out it does not. So we looked into a national database of property owners in America a few years ago, and it turns out that landlords in poor neighborhoods, after all expenses, make not just more than landlords in affluent neighborhoods, but make double what landlords in affluent neighborhoods make. And the reason's pretty simple. In most cities, the operating costs in poor neighborhoods are much lower, but the rent isn't that much lower. And so you have higher profits. And so this is the way that poverty is just deeply connected to exploitation, which I know is a very morally charged word, but it just means like you don't have any choice, right? You're kind of over a barrel, and when you're in that position, people take advantage of you.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty extraordinary when you think about this notion that apartments in poor neighborhoods like in Englewood or Lawndale here in Chicago is, you know, comparable in price to a place on the north side. Right. And because one would think that, you know, that's why people live in these communities, is because it's less expensive.
Right. I remember discovering this in Milwaukee, where I lived in this mobile home park. I paid $550 a month. This was in 2008, 2009. So $550 a month to rent a trailer with no hot water. Then I moved to the north side of Milwaukee, and the 2 bedrooms, which is the inner city Milwaukee, and it's $550 a month. Everywhere, $550 a month. And the citywide median is $600, right? So living in these incredibly poor neighborhoods, you pay less, but you don't pay that much less. You get a lot worse housing, you got a lot more poverty, and you're paying just below the citywide median.
And the other part that you write here too is that, you know, these are your words, we're all on the dole. That, you know, that when we think of the welfare state, we tend to focus on the poor, but that we all are part of this welfare state.
Yeah. So this is like a hard pill for a lot of us to swallow, but like a tax break and a housing voucher are the same thing. They both cost the government money. They both put money in our pockets. They both contribute to the deficit. So like a mortgaged suburban home and Cabrini Green are both government subsidized, but only one looks and feels that way. And so if you add up tax breaks, social insurance programs, and means-tested programs, basically everything the government does for us, you learn that the average family in the top 20% of the income distribution gets about $36,000 a year from the government. And the average family in the bottom 20% gets about $25,000 from the government. That's almost a 40% difference, right? We just do a lot more to subsidize affluence in the country than to alleviate poverty. And then we have like the shamelessness to look at like the cost of like reducing child poverty or giving everyone a doctor and just be like, how on earth would we pay for this? And it's just such a sinful, dishonest question if the answer isn't staring us straight in the face.
And practically, I mean, do you come to the place where you think we should get rid of something like the mortgage interest deduction?
Unequivocally.
Unequivocally.
Because it doesn't do anything to help home ownership.
Mm-hmm.
You know what helps home ownership? Like a down payment, right? So that doesn't do anything to help home ownership. All it does is make our homes more expensive than they should be, if we didn't have it. Now, we can talk abstractly about this, but it's like, the truth is like most of the benefit from the mortgage interest deduction accrues to families with six-figure incomes, like above $200,000. Most white families in America are homeowners. Most Black and Latinx families aren't because of our systematic dispossession of people of color from the land. So this isn't just about like this abstract thing. It's about this thing that is incredibly regressive, right? Gives most to families that need it the least. As we have this eviction crisis, right? Where like an eviction is filed in America every 7 seconds. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense. In 2001, we spent $190 billion on homeowner tax subsidies and $53 billion on direct housing assistance to the needy. So we have a universal housing program, but it's just not for poor people. This doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I think that we should wind down things like the mortgage interest deduction, and I think that's just one place to start, actually.
And politically, has it ever been a part of the conversation?
Totally. So, this deduction specifically, it's like, you guys are like, I gave up my beautiful spring day to come to talk about the mortgage interest deduction. So this deduction was an accident. It started in the 1930s. It got in our tax code to help small business owners. And then, boom, World War II hits. We have the GI Bill. We suddenly become a nation of homeowners, especially for white homeowners. And then suddenly this thing is like baked in to a lot of Americans' budgets. And then this lobby forms around it. It's called the realtors. So if you line up lobbyists in Washington just based on the money they spend every year, it goes like this: Chamber of Commerce, realtors. Like not big guns or big pharma, realtors. They spend gobs of money, and their number one issue is protecting the mortgage interest deduction. And so when I wrote Evicted, and I started going around being like, can we have a lot more housing vouchers, please? People are like dying out there. And people are like, well, how would you pay for this? I was like, I have this clear idea how to pay for it. They'd be like, you can't touch that. That's the third rail of politics. You can't touch it, you can't touch it. And then like, who touched it? Trump. Trump touched it. During his tax reform, he lowered the mortgage interest deduction, something that like liberal housers have been arguing for years. So it's kind of funny. I mean, sometimes things are impossible until they're not, This is where I want to make this conversation personal, though, like personal. And so tax season is upon us. And so the way we usually talk about taxes is like this: fuck, I gotta pay my taxes, And everyone does this, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. So what if we, like the next time our coworker or our neighbor, whoever said that to us, we were just like, dude, do you know what's insane? I get to deduct the interest of my mortgage for my $800,000 house when like we have this like housing crisis that's brutalizing renting families. And this makes no sense to me. I'm going to donate my money that I get from this to my local eviction defense, and I'm going to write my congressperson saying, I don't want this anymore. So when we talk about these issues, this sounds very abstract, But I think to get to a place, it means building political will, which means that many of us that benefit from this kind of arrangement need to start questioning it, right? Pushing back, changing the common sense, I think.
Right. No, it's going to require, I think, I mean, this is sound glib, but some sacrifice, and not a lot. I mean, that's, I'm always reminded, of Nicole Hannah-Jones had that beautiful piece in the New York Times Magazine a number of years ago about her daughter and trying to decide where to send her to school. And it was a story about school segregation. But in the end, what she said basically is if we're really going to talk about integrating our schools, we need to be able to talk about sacrifice. And people are going to have to make choices about where they send their kids. It may not be what they initially want. And I think that's part of what I took away from your book as well. I mean, both a personal and collective sacrifice. I don't mean that it's, but I want to, before we talk about sort of where do we go from here and sort of what we do practically, I do want to talk about where race fits into all this. And you talk very openly about integration in the book, but I think mostly about really integration by class, by social strata. So, but can you talk a little bit about race and?
It's just it's so central to this issue. Like on every turn, it's there. There's a chapter in the book about labor market exploitation. Labor market discrimination against black men hasn't changed in 30 years. 30 years, like a generation, no progress on this. Integration, I feel, is something that the book really takes on as a key component of this whole thing. And part of that definitely means racial integration and tearing down the walls. When we think about opportunity hoarding in communities that are drawing walls around themselves made out of laws and hoarding affluence behind those walls, this is really, we're really talking about affluent white communities. This isn't a political statement, it's like an empirical statement, right? White folks are the most segregated group in the country. So the book asks for a tearing down of walls and embracing of like inclusionary zoning laws and inclusive broad prosperity in our communities. And I think that has a racial component too, hugely, right? So a lot of times there's studies that show that the way parents are evaluating schools doesn't have to do much with test scores and stuff as much as like the racial composition of the schools. And so again, this is a place to take it personally. So when we're talking about tearing down the walls or changing zoning laws, what I'm talking about is like us who live in those kind of communities, like hauling our butts to like a zoning board meeting on a Wednesday night at 8 o'clock and standing up and being like, no, I think we should build this here. Like I refuse to deny these kids opportunities my kids have had living here, build this thing. So I think that the book is always trying to take these very abstract or even structural things and turn them into personal, commitments, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I think about in Chicago, of course we had the transformation plan of public housing, where we decided to audaciously tear down all the high rises. And the idea was we were going to build all these integrated communities, integrated not by race, but by class. And there were two things that were striking to me is one, I mean, here was this opportunity to talk about racial integration again. I mean, it's been completely lost from the political conversation. There was no talk about that at all. And then, of course, we've never upheld the promises, and there's nobody out there sort of holding anybody accountable for that.
Yeah, I feel like even on the progressive side of this conversation, often the most audacious anti-poverty programs have nothing to do with segregation. Right, there are things like universal basic income. So it's like, let's be separate and just a little less equal, a little less unequal. And so I do think that there's a lot of science behind this though. Like there's a lot of, there's this study out of Maryland that I find very convincing where they took public housing families and they randomized them. And some kids were housed, and families were housed in integrated neighborhoods. They went to integrated schools. Some kids were housed in segregated neighborhoods, went to segregated schools. But the segregated schools got like a ton of resources, like a ton of resources. They followed the kids. And the kids who went to the integrated schools did a lot better, because, making those, even like dumping money into the school, throwing money over the wall, so to speak, doesn't make those schools anything close to equal. And I want to say, I was kind of talking about this the other day, and older African American gentlemen stood up and saying like, well, what about black schools and black communities? We need these, And I think that sometimes when we talk about integration, often for those folks who are living in black communities, they hear, here's another thing we have to do, and like, okay, here we go. But that's because affluent white communities have been so good at not doing their part, right? They've been so good at making that wall high that when we talk about building affordable housing, we often only can do it in low-income communities. And so you turn folks that are already like on the edge of the rental housing crisis, having to worry about gentrification. It's such a weird bargain we strike because this kind of resistance from the top.
Can you talk about the program you mentioned in New Jersey, and which I found interesting, where I guess each municipality is required to provide a certain measure of affordable housing?
Yeah. So this is called the Mount Laurel Doctrine. It's a New Jersey state law, and it was the result of incredible organizing by an African American community around Cherry Hill, New Jersey, who had been in that community for years and years and years. And it kind of got white gentrified, and they were getting pushed out, and they fought, and they won. And New Jersey has this law that says, okay, every municipality has to build their fair share of affordable housing. That fair share being a calculation on how many folks live there, how many jobs are there. And if you live in a municipality and you refuse to do your fair share, courts can redraw your zoning laws. And so you have a very big incentive, if you're a suburban community, to figure out where you're going to build that affordable housing and draw the zoning laws itself to do so. And when you do it, there's often like developer interest to build all this affordable housing because developers can make a higher rate of return on multifamily units than they can on these like 2,500 square foot McMansions, even if there's affordable housing cutouts. So New Jersey not only has affordable housing in every municipality in the state, basically, but it also has built a lot of affordable housing without a dime of federal or state money. But it's a fight. It's always a fight. And I don't know if y'all have ever been to a zoning board meeting, but they're violent. They're violent. And this is an area where it doesn't break down along party lines. There's a study that showed that conservative renters are more likely to vote yes on an affordable housing project in their community than liberal homeowners. So maybe we're not so polarized after all.
And what do you think the reason is for that?
I think that a lot of us, our values stop at our property line. And look, I get it. Like a lot of us, for most Americans, right, our nest egg is all in our home value. It's all in the home value. You're thinking about your retirement, where your kids are going to go to college, or what you're going to leave when you die. It's in that home value. And if you think anything can threaten that home value, you get really, really scared. And so I think that there's a part of this work that's saying, look, we can do this without hurting home values. And that's true. There's a lot of research behind this. But there is a part of this work that's just straight up on a moral level, I think, about saying, look, we can't keep doing this anymore. These excuses, they're the same excuses our fathers and our grandfathers used too.
One of the things I love about this book is that it's, and you can hear it in the stories you tell, it's very much a call to action. And it's also surprisingly hopeful. And there are two stories that I think are worth revisiting to give us some optimism for what lies ahead. And I'll start with the most recent and then go back to the other one. But I want to start with COVID, where we had this experience where we actually reduced the child poverty rate in half in a matter of months.
6 months.
Yeah. Can you talk about what we got right there and why it is that we haven't continued doing it? Yeah.
That's a hard question. So the pandemic arrives and the government responds with bold relief. We immediately are plunged into an eviction crisis, unlike any other advanced democracy. It wasn't like the pandemic hit France and France was like, oh my gosh, we have an eviction crisis. We did though. And so the government responds with an eviction moratorium. Now, to us, it's like, yeah, that's what happened. But like, remember when it started? Like, housing organizers were like, we need an eviction moratorium, we need an eviction moratorium, and they were getting laughed out of the room by liberal allies. But then like, North Carolina passed one, and Massachusetts passed one, North Dakota passed one, and then the Trump administration, under the Centers for Disease Control, passed an eviction moratorium that decreased eviction rates by stopped evictions basically, decreased the COVID death rate by 11%, saved tens of thousands of lives. But then we were like, okay, what happens when the rent bill comes due? So then the government was like, okay, we're gonna allocate $46.5 billion to emergency rental assistance. That's like doubling HUD's budget. This is like the deepest investment the federal government has made in the lives of renting families since like the invention of public housing in America. That reached tens of millions of families in the end, and it dropped evictions to the lowest on record. And then we had basically a universal basic income program for moderate and low-income families in the form of a child tax credit. And that simple program, which is basically a subsidy to families below a certain income level of kids, reduced child poverty by 46% in 6 months. After the Great Recession, it took Americans in the bottom half of the income distribution 10 years to recover their incomes. It took a decade for the poorest among us to get back to where we were before 2008 hit. After this recession, it took those families about a year and a half. It was this incredible flex from the government. And so I think there's a few lessons for us. One lesson is government aid really works. It really works. We know how to do this. We have the resources to do it. Now, some of us might be thinking, but didn't we pay for that with inflation? Didn't we pay for that with inflation? And I just have to say that I'm so tired of that question. Because
Well, I'm just glad I didn't ask it.
I mean, if you look at the data, you see that the reason we're getting price increases is because corporations had this incredible market power during COVID if they can loose the supply chain, and they took advantage of the market power. So a study out of the Kansas City Fed shows that corporate markups, basically profit markups, are responsible for about 58% of the inflationary pressure we're feeling today. And wage increases are responsible for like 8%. And then we have the audacity to get on television and just tell workers like they're gonna have to take the hard medicine, that they're gonna have to swallow it. And for me, just as a tenured professor, to hear other tenured professors that have like the best job security in the world, to be like, these workers, these long haul truckers, these home health aides are gonna have to take the hard medicine. How dare us say this, And so, no, I don't think we had to pay that cost. We didn't pay it in the 40s, right? We didn't pay it in the 40s when we had massive inflation after GI Bill and other interventions. We don't have to pay it in Europe, that has much more deeper investments in the people than we do, and we don't have to pay it here. So I think there's really great lessons. But then there's this other question you asked, which is like, why didn't we keep it? And this sounds glib, but we didn't care enough. Like, Congress should have been terrified to take away the child tax credit from us. It should have been terrified to take away emergency rental assistance from us. And we, those of us that are committed to poverty abolitionism, to like economic justice in the country, we should have raised a fuss, and we just didn't. We just didn't. And, the poor in the future are gonna pay for our silence.
And the other moment in time I want to ask you about is back in the 1960s,
Yeah.
where, and as you point out, we were as polarized then as we are now. And yet we had the war on poverty, the Great Society.
Yeah.
We had Job Corps, Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps.
Yeah.
What do you take from that moment? And this is where I want to talk about, sort of bring it to this moment in time where we're also incredibly polarized. And are there lessons that we can take from that to the present?
I was really inspired by Julian Zelazar's book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, where he makes his case. He's a historian. And, 60s, Southern Dixiecrats were aligned with Republicans, blocking progressive reform. Senators were sleeping in their offices. Government obstructionism wasn't just the outcome, it was like the goal. Sound familiar? And so that was the political situation in which the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, and 68 were passed. That's the situation in which we got the modern social safety net, the war on poverty, and the Great Society, which cut poverty rates in half. And Zalazar makes this really convincing case that the reason that happened was because movements, especially the labor, the civil rights movement, put unrelenting pressure on policymakers. They captured the public imagination. And that should give us hope, I think. We've been here before, and our hope lies with movements. And I think that, again, like, we just can't kick the can down the road. You know, we can't just be like, oh my gosh, well, if the Republicans didn't capture the House, well, we can, oh, Joe Manchin, oh, can you imagine if the civil rights movement was like, oh man, there's like a lot of racists in Congress. Like, I don't know, like, what should we do? Like, and so I just think that we have to keep pushing.
And do you see that movement gathering? Or?
So yes, but it has to grow. Right. It has to be a mass movement. So I think you could look at the Poor People's Campaign or National Workers Alliance, the new labor movements is incredibly exciting. You can see movements for housing justice that I don't think we've seen since the Great Depression bubbling up all over the country. Things that when I published Evicted, things that were seen as like incredibly radical, like rent stabilization, are now like ballot measures in several states across the country. So I think that these movements are incredibly exciting, but they also just need us. They just need more people. So if you're interested in joining a movement, I have a website for you. There's a website, it's called endpovertyusa.org, endpovertyusa.org, that I launched with this book, that just connects you with anti-poverty movements in Illinois or Michigan or wherever you live, or at the federal level, and you can get plugged in. And like, you might not think of yourself as a movement person. I also do not think of myself as a movement person, but like, movements don't just need folks to march in the street. They need accountants and lawyers and nurses and artists, maybe even a writer or two. So I think that there's room for you to plug in. And when I read stories in the paper about like cancel culture on the left, I'm like, gosh, that doesn't sound like the movements I know. Like, so if you're looking for like a warm-hearted, joyous, meaningful place, I have a recommendation for you.
So your book hasn't been out very long, but the response has been just extraordinary. And I'm wondering whether you've had the opportunity to talk to politicians. I know you're going to talk to some economists tomorrow.
Pray for me.
I'm wondering what kind of response you're getting. And I also wonder, too, whether you've had an opportunity to talk to our new mayor in Chicago.
I have an opportunity, but what a great choice you made. I haven't had an opportunity to talk to Mr. Mayor yet. I haven't had the opportunity to talk to a lot of policymakers yet. I met with the mayor of Minneapolis last week. After Evicted came out, there was a lot of policy work that got done, and I'm going to the White House to do more policy work soon. But I think
around this book?
Around this book, yeah. And meeting with the Democratic caucus and that. But I think it's a little too early for me to have a meaningful answer to you right now. Yeah.
Have you heard from the other side of the aisle at all, or from Republicans?
I've heard from Republicans on the ground, and I've got some hate mail, but also like, I've got some hate, but I've also got a lot of notes that are like, I'm a conservative, this is how I feel about this, I want to make this better. And I think that on the ground, I don't think the US people are as polarized as our representatives are. And there's a story in the book that I love that was told to me by an organizer at One Fair Wage. So One Fair Wage is like a group that fights minimum wage, like tips and sub-minimum wage, and which is a vestige of slavery. And they were protesting at Albany in New York, and it was mostly black and brown women from New York City. And but But it was the same day that the legislature was ratifying the Biden election, so there was a Stop the Steal rally, the same day. And so the MAGA guys come over to the One Fair Wage guys, and they're like, what are you protesting? And they're like, well, we want higher wages. And the red hats were like, well, we want that too. And they shook their hands and they joined the protest. Kind of interesting, you know? And so I think that, look, we don't agree on everything, but on issues of basic economic fairness, I think there's a lot more overlap than I think that is represented in Congress.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think I've always sort of, as a storyteller, operated on this notion that there is this fundamental belief in this country that life ought to be fair. And if you can just get people to see what you see, that they'll get there on their own. So can I ask, how has this working on this book changed the way you think about your own life?
I think it's convicting. It's challenging. You know, I think that there's a story I tell in the book about this group in Minneapolis, United Renters for Justice. And they're this like scrappy group of tenants. And they were in 5 buildings in Minneapolis, and they had a negligent landlord, and they started protesting against them, little by little. A lot of undocumented immigrants, a lot of folks spoke different languages. They'd communicate across Google Translate app. And they battled with this landlord. They raised enough money to buy back their apartments from him. But by that time, he wanted to evict everyone, pass out eviction notices. And so this kind of case came to a head where, you know, they were either going to be homeowners or homeless. And we went to the first eviction case, and I was sitting with the tenants waiting for the jury to decide. It was an unusual eviction case, a jury case. And this woman sitting next to me, Takara, she was like, do you know what's taking the jury so long? They're asking themselves, why do these tenants want this rundown building? And it's because people have forgotten how to dream. And when she said that to me, I was so convicted. You know, I was kind of like, I cut my teeth in policy schools. I was about pragmatics. What do studies show? Like, what is the scalable thing? What can we get through bipartisan Congress? I wasn't dreaming at all. And so I think that hanging out with folks that are asking these incredibly audacious things, and by the way, they won, and now they like live in those buildings, and they're theirs. You know, I think hanging out with these movements that are really imagining a new possibility and then willing it into existence was really convicting for me. And then just, you know, figuring out all these ways that we're implicated in poverty and trying to slowly but surely like divest. So like when you buy something, is that a union-made thing? How do you know? Like, you know, so doing a bit more research, looking a bit more in our savings portfolio, looking at that. I think, you know, and also getting more integrated into anti-poverty movements than before. So I don't, like, it's a struggle for me. You know, I think like I try, I fail. I still have an Amazon account, for example, you know, like, but I think it's like that's kind of the price of our restored humanity in a way, that struggle.
Right. Well, you become more self-conscious about where you fit in, I think, which is important. And the other part, as you say, I mean, you also, it sounds like you've kind of found a community that you feel a part of.
And accountable to.
Yeah.
I gave a talk at Princeton the week the book came out. And the first question was this white woman. She stood up and she said, I volunteer in Trenton. So if you guys know anything about Princeton, Princeton is affluent, home to my university, and Trenton's like 15 minutes away. It's a very poor capital city. So she's like, I volunteer in Trenton, and we give a lot of mentoring to these kids in Trenton, and what about the moms? Shouldn't we be mentoring the moms? And I looked at the audience, and I saw my friend Vanessa, who's a single mom in Trenton, you know? And I was like, I have to answer this question in a way that honors Vanessa. And I think that being in community with folks, and you've made a career out of this, these deep relationships with folks, I think makes you write differently and holds you different, like accountable differently in your work than if you're out of community.
Do you think it'll change you or has changed you as a writer?
Yeah, I think that, I'm trying to think about how to answer that question. one thing I felt myself doing, I was on social media a lot after Evicted, and one thing I felt was my writing getting pulled in that direction, in that echo chamber. And that echo chamber in my social media life was a bunch of folks that looked a lot like me, had the same kind of degrees I have, you know? And I just felt like I was writing scared, and I wasn't writing originally, you know? And so I left Twitter, I gave it up for Lent, and I recently got back on to pump this book. And I think that being in communication and community with them, I think it changes my horizon of possibilities, and it makes me accountable to their criticisms along with different kind of criticisms in worlds that I'm already in, like the academic world. So like, I remember being in the San Francisco Fed right after Evicted came out, and they put me right in the middle of this room, and on the one hand, of this side of the room were like tenant organizers in San Francisco, so like the best tenant organizers in the country. And then on this side of the room were like real estate interests in San Francisco, so like the scariest real estate interests in the country. And I was like in the middle, like as a kid, and then they were like peppering me with questions, and I got this question about rent control. What do you think about rent control? And so I had read all the studies about rent control. And so I reported, like a book report, like, well, this is what the studies say about rent control. And they're not very kindly. They don't show kindly to rent control. Basically, the economic literature is like, rent control is great if you have it, but it decreases affordable housing for everyone else. So after the talk, this guy named Dean Preston, tenant organizer, pulled me aside. He's like, yo, I've read those studies too. And the reason this is happening is because there's condo conversions, and couldn't we regulate that? And why do you talk about this as like an economic law? And I was like, right. And so I think that being in those conversations, right, holds you accountable differently than if you would otherwise, yeah.
Cool. I want to tell you a little bit about writing. I don't wear a watch, so tell me what time it is so I know what we have.
Lonnie says 5 minutes.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about your life as a writer.
Yeah.
One of the things that's remarkable to me about the book is I felt your anger and indignant fury on every page. Maybe because I kind of know who you are. And yet I felt like the book was so craftily done that it allowed me to sort of find my own anger and indignant fury by the end. And so this is a book that's very different from Evicted. Evicted was these beautiful narratives, these intimate tales of people struggling and persevering, a book filled with empathy. This is really an essay, again, a kind of critique. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your process in writing this book and how you thought about it differently than what you've done before?
I love this kind of idea of anger. My editor, Amanda Cook, she always says you have to let readers own their own anger. Mm-hmm. And so don't rap on the chalkboard, try to, create this space. And in Evicted, I played with that a little bit, where I talk about exploitation in Evicted, but only at the very end, where I'm hoping when a reader gets to that, they're like, of course, And so I think but in this book, we get to exploitation pretty quickly, because it's a book about the fire, right? And so I think that I'm trying to shift the aperture of the poverty debate. I think that the poverty debate has been completely reactive. It has not controlled the questions, and I'm trying to control the question. I'm trying to have a different conversation, and that different conversation means putting a mirror up to a lot of us. And I think when we have a hard look, it's hard not to be a bit angry about what we've allowed our country to become. And that's especially true for those of us that love people that are struggling and have family members that are struggling. And then are met with just these like cliches of inequality, these platitudes of inequality that have captured the poverty debate for so long. So,
but what was nice about this book, and I don't know how to. I mean, I think about your personality, which is that you're angry with a smile, and that's how I felt with the book as well. Yeah. I mean, there was even humor in it, and so. I just wonder, were you thinking about that? I mean, you had mentioned over lunch that your editor, for example, said, write this book like you're talking to someone at a bar.
Yeah. That's right.
And you don't want to get someone at a bar too angry.
No, yeah. Or if you have a situation on your hands. That's right. And I think that I hope that there's some empathy for the reader too, you know, and a kind of like, look, I get it, but like we got to do better, you know. And I try to channel that a little bit. I also think if you can get a reader or an audience to laugh, they just trust you a little more, you know, and they'll go with you a little longer than they would if they feel sermonized to or lectured to. So there's a bit about that. I also have to say too, this book was written in deep community. So I went through these 2 intense book workshops where folks like Kianga Yamada Taylor and Tressie Cotton and Bruce Western and Sarah Stillman at the New Yorker, you know, East Coast group like came along and really criticized and pushed back and told me to reach for more. And so whole chapters got decimated through that, you know. And also things that I think really matter for the book, like this call for poverty abolition, came out of those meetings. And so writing through and in community was really important for me too.
I guess as a writer, that's a really scary notion. So, well, this is just, I mean, it's a remarkable book.
Thanks,
and I urge everyone in this room, I know you all are getting copies, but not only to read them, but to pass them on, or better yet, for Matt, have other people buy them. And but for me, it feels like a catalyst. It feels like a moment where you're not only asking for change, but I think we may see it. Thanks.
Thanks so much.